Welcome to Christendom Conversations. Together we'll explore the wisdom of the Catholic intellectual tradition, engage with thought-provoking ideas, and uncover deep insights into the perennial questions. We're thrilled to have you with us. Let's dive into today's conversation. Also, great pleasure to have Jon Kirwan with us today for this Christendom Conversation. Jon is a good friend. I think of you as a theologian, but I also think of you as a man who knows a great deal about education. And you will be the director of our Center for Educational Philosophy and Leadership here at the college, and looking forward to seeing how that develops. And we'll be talking more about that in a bit. So maybe we could start off by saying a bit about your background. I mean, you have a very interesting background. You've taught in some very interesting places. It's not the normal background for a typical academic. And it combines things that are often held separate in people's lives. Could you say a bit about your background and how you made this your journey professionally and in terms of your education?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and really looking forward to seeing the great work here unfold. My own background really began in education in the late 90s, in Catholic education. And I did a master's in education, and then really kind of went off for, a dozen years or something around there to go work in some very challenged schools. I worked at a mission school on the Navajo Reservation, spent several years working at a school in South Central Los Angeles, created a literacy center in Watts that serviced, almost 100 students. And we employed 20 local teachers. Worked in some other challenged parts of LA, did some teacher training in sub-Saharan Africa, lived with Mother Teresa sisters in Tijuana and did some work there. So this really gave me a kind of a broad and expansive vision of Catholic education, not only its challenges, but also, kind of its ideals. And so I moved on to academic theology, did my Ph.D. in theology, but education has always been, near and dear to my heart, and I've never been far from thinking about it. And so several years ago, the opportunity came to stay still within kind of the arena of academic theology, but begin to develop and run some graduate programs in education. So this gave me a real opportunity to think deeply about challenges and possibilities. And my theological specialty is 20th century Catholic thought, sure, and especially as, kind of related to modern philosophical challenges. So as I moved over to education, I found that this really prepared me very well to start engaging in some of the modern questions that we're dealing with, and even, kind of some of the philosophical problems that we're dealing with.
Yeah. One of the pleasures of having conversations with you is we can pivot back and forth between the very speculative, and then do the historical back to the very practical, and these things come together in a very integrated way, in unexpected ways. So for people who are paying attention, we seem to be in a perpetual crisis with regard to education, but it seems to have gotten to even a higher pitch recently. People are even more engaged and worried. And it's not from a lack of resources being put into it, whether we're talking about diocesan education or the private schools or even public schools. People are putting a lot of money, a lot of time, and there are a lot of people who are very. Basically, they're giving their lives to this project. Parents are very concerned, and yet we seem to be falling further and further behind every year. And there are some solutions that seem to be emerging on the horizon. But I'm interested, maybe before we look at some of those solutions, we talk about how we got here. How is it that our country isn't educating its children and its young adults? How is and I don't mean just in the public schools, but there seem to be struggles across almost any form of education. There are bright lights, there are things that seem to be succeeding, but by and large, most people are dissatisfied with how education is going in this country. How did we end up here?
Well, there is a crisis. You're absolutely right. And the crisis is undeniable, and it seems to be getting worse almost by the day. And so what we see is a fragmentation of mainstream education. Let's just call it kind of a mainstream approach. And what we mean by that is education, funded by governments, by private entities, and they are increasingly challenged. They're fragmented. It's a crisis of fragmentation, and the center isn't holding. And for a long time, over a century, the progressive ed movement was kind of held together as a coalition of kind of progressive pedagogical thinkers, bureaucrats who wanted to centralize everything, political ideologues who hoped for a kind of radicalization, and big business, which wanted workers educated, right? And so this coalition, which really began, let's just say right around 1900, it's really developed, and it's always been tenuous. It's always been a negotiated middle between these various entities, which oftentimes are not aligned themselves. And so, I mean, at the root of all of it is, the pragmatism that we think of with John Dewey, where there's this kind of radical denial of truth itself, right? There's even the possibility of truth is denied, the possibility of real contemplation, real wisdom in the traditional sense, goodness, beauty, right? We throw these words around a lot in this attempt at a modern recovery, right? But I mean, goodness is what it's being itself, but it's the perfection of the thing. It's the we think about things towards an end, things that have value in and of themselves. I mean, this idea of contemplation and a real wisdom. All of these things are thrown out. They're inadmissible on philosophical grounds because we are only able to deal with what can be scientifically measured, matter in motion, basically. And this kind of radical denial of truth, this was a battle, and sometimes people are uncomfortable with that word. They should go back and read the early Dewey. Dewey was uncompromising. He was unsparing in his criticism, wildly unfair. Right? There was no attempt at a charitable reading of the tradition. He was clearly trying to blow things up. And what happens is, as Dewey starts to get traction, with this, with his educational creed, which denies all of these absolutes, these objective realities that have governed Western education for many centuries, right? The school centralization movement picks up, right? And so there is this strong tendency to take the authority away from the parents, away from teachers, and then away from principals, and then even away from superintendents, and on, right? So the pedagogical progressives like Dewey and the bureaucrats, there was a bit of common cause, although much tension as well, right? In the 30s, things began to really get radicalized as people like George Counts and even Dewey himself, they went to Russia and they reframed the need. The need is we need to kind of adopt the Russian system. And curriculum studies begins in the 40s, and curriculum studies, the whole purpose basically was to kind of create an institution that could provide, kind of a Dewey's framework for what should be taught and when, Things continue to be radicalized. In the 60s, Freire, of course, is one of the most well-cited books in social science research. Michel Foucault, the post-structuralist, his thought takes over curriculum studies in the 80s. Right. And so these four, and then of course this fourth, big textbook, Inc. Right? I mean, this is the fourth denominator, and this is always there's an enormous amounts of money to be made, not only by the bureaucracy and the universities, but also through this, kind of unstable curricular, revisions, where every 10 years there's another, $10 million, $20 million rollout. Yeah. As social science supposedly kind of, tells us that what we've been doing is wrong, and now,
Yeah. Well, in what you just described, it reminded me of, I'm thinking of sort of the Cartesian Baconian inversion in early modernity, where basically the contemplative and the active lives were flipped. Mm-hmm. So whereas the contemplative had been the highest form of life, the active suddenly became, and the practical, what can we do with this knowledge, became the real question. And that was moving along, and there were things that were, society had changed its values, but things were moving along in a way that wasn't. It was different, but then that met progressivism, which was which just became it became that inversion on steroids. Yeah, and then and then you get this sort of historical reframing, as you say, Freire and Foucault, and it's just been accelerating, it seems, from that point on. And then there also does seem to be this question: we've got to educate masses of amount of people. So we've opened up universities, and sort of this radical commitment that we have to sort of universal education, and then of course the big money that comes into that. How do you do you think that most people who were involved in teaching and both at the public school level but also the Catholic school level, do you think they were aware of the sort of these different streams?
Yeah. One of the most shocking things about teaching, working with teachers, is they have almost no idea of their history. I mean, they have a general idea that it used to be bad and now it's good. It used to be, it used to be segregated. It was imbued with racism, and now it's egalitarian. And this was one of the most surprising things, is even working with public school administrators.
Right.
If you ask them, tell me about what you know about the history of progressive ed, most of them they'll leave the page blank. They don't know anything.
Yeah.
And so when I found that when they read how radical it is, and they read, for example, and this, one of the most surprising things is we have, for example, progressive education was very closely tied to the eugenics movement. It was tied to the social efficiency movement.
Right.
If things can only be useful, well, the factory owners found that very helpful, right? Because they needed Irish immigrants and minorities with just enough education to work in the factories. And it was the liberal arts crowd that was saying, like, no, people should get off the ladder of education when they want to get off the ladder of education, because Shakespeare is something everybody should do, no matter how you earn your paycheck, because the life of the mind is its own end.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people that are kind of steeped in the progressive education mentality are shocked at that. Wait, it was the liberal arts crowd that said women shouldn't necessarily be in home ec. They should be in. They should necessarily be in with everybody else. Reading poetry and learning Latin.
Yeah.
And that was in the early. It was like 1910. These battles were being fought 100 years ago. There's these battles were in many ways dictated the kind of the discourse of American culture during that period.
Yeah, and so people didn't really understand. I mean, I think when I think about the past, I think of it as sort of there was the reading, the writing, and the arithmetic, and then there was just the goal was to sort of spread this out across a much broader, make it available to everyone.
Yeah,
that was sort of the goal, and then something seemed to go wrong at some point. Yeah. But it's not very clear. And my undergraduate degree was in music, but it was in music ed. Yeah. So I took the history of education courses. I took these things, and it was just. And it's kind of a wig history. It's just things are just constantly getting better. And yet, if you open your eyes and look around, it's not. Mm-hmm. And even the people who were taking these courses, and even maybe those who were teaching them, it seemed to just kind of a flat history, and there was no sense of any sort of real significant change, just gradual emergence. Right. So if this is the sort of the diagnosis, right? There's this a kind of fusionism applied to education that brings these different entities together and these different interests. What is the solution? And can you sort of put that in a historical framework? Like, when did people start waking up and going, wait, something's wrong? Wrong with this?
It's interesting because, of course, the progressive ed crowd, history and literature, Latin, classical languages, arithmetic. I mean, these things should only be taught insofar as they're somehow useful. And if they're not useful, they need to be expunged from the curriculum, right? And of course, the liberal arts defenders were up in arms. And there was an interesting quote that I came across where even in kind of 1930, where the progressive ed crowd, they said, we're never going to take over. Like everybody's against us. They've got all the institutional power. And it's taking too long, But they kept their nose to the grindstone, and it was kind of the long march through the institutions. And then, within 20 years, by the 50s, they had the upper hand. But there was still, kind of a lot of forward momentum of, kind of the Western patrimony of literature, poetry, art, music, languages. And there was a lot of forward momentum that. So there was another kind of a jump start in the progressive movement, especially after Freire, who Freire doesn't. Interestingly, I mean, he's writing in the early 70s, even late 60s, but he doesn't become popular until he's Americanized in the 80s, and then that really provides a real radicalization, a real Marxification to the whole program of education. So what's interesting here is the Catholic schools, right, remained outside of this whole stream. I mean, of course, in 1888, right? The Catholic school system is started by the bishops in Baltimore precisely because there's too much anti-Catholicism in the common schools of Horace Mann. And so there was a real clinging to this kind of patrimony. And then in the 50s, when you start, when you start looking at Catholic educational periodicals and books and things, there's this push to like, look, we need to adopt Dewey. We need to be contemporary. We need to be with the times. And so now, there in many cases, there's many exceptions to this, but in many cases they're indistinguishable. Right. In terms of they've adopted the curriculum. It's kind of selected public schools with a religion curriculum.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So this one of the descriptions that I've heard given is that what you just said, which is that there's this idea that there's a vision of reality and of the human person and of God, and it's an integrated vision. But and you've got this in theology, your theology courses. But then you change, the bell rings, you change classes, and you go to these other courses, and there's a different view of the human person in biology. There's a different view of the human person in English, your literature course, and you've got and so the student ends up with this kind of mix of different worldviews or perspectives, and it's not integrated. And so while some schools may have held to some form of orthodoxy in theology, all the other disciplines were essentially floating along in the same way that they were in the secular disciplines. They might not be hostile, but it was almost as if, having been accepted by the secular world, that was like, okay, now we want to do whatever we have to do to maintain that acceptance, and we're going to go along with it. But there was a lack of integration across the disciplines of a vision. Not that they were necessarily making every class into a theology class, but there was an integrated vision of the whole. What's the solution to that? I mean, how do you begin to reintegrate all these broken pieces that are sort of floating on the ocean after this train wreck?
What's interesting is Chesterton. My starting point for bringing things together and working with a whole range of educators, some from the public schools who are very much kind of permeated by progressive ed thinking, which is fine. Those are always interesting people for me to work with and try to kind of provide a different vision. Or Catholic educators who get it, Catholic educators who well-formed, right, across the board. And I always begin with kind of a philosophical introduction. And G.K. Chesterton has that great article on, why we need good philosophy, and why we need good philosophy is, to combat bad philosophy. And if you don't spend a little bit of time and learn to focus your intellectual resources to develop your own philosophy, you're going to be cobbling together the shards of somebody else's broken philosophy. And so the very first thing, what strikes me again and again and again, as I said, is teachers have no understanding. They have very strong opinions about all of these current issues in education, but they have no philosophical vocabulary or formation to even understand that these are really philosophical battles we've been fighting for 100 years, 125 years. And so the very first thing is to show them that, look, there are two paths here. Right, and let's just say two conceptions of wisdom, right? So on the one hand, we have the classical conception of wisdom. Let's just say, as articulated by St. Thomas, right? Wisdom is its knowledge of the first cause, right? Of the higher truths. It's a knowledge of ultimate reality, right? But it's also, wisdom is also a habit, right? It's a habitus. It's cultivated through contemplation and virtue, right? It's it's constantly orienting ourselves towards our highest end, right? And it is true realism. It's in kind of even the Aristotelian sense of giving a full account of everything that we experience, and how these things lead us, and how wisdom is the ordering of knowledge, and understands that knowledge is ordered, it's unified, and there's a hierarchy to it. Right, so it's a big, bold, beautiful, expansive vision, realism. Right, and the other, as Dewey redefines wisdom, it's there is no truth, there is no beauty. Right, beauty is only practical. Beauty is what's politically expedient. Right, goodness is whatever seems to be politically efficacious, socially efficacious. All knowledge is constructed, and so there is very much this Hegelian tendency. And Dewey, really surprisingly, you wouldn't think of this in 19th century America. He had an early Hegelian formation in Vermont, with the very first wave of American Hegelians,
Wow.
right? Because you read him and you think, well, this is kind of American Kantianism, but where's the progressivism coming from? No, his was coming from, these strange, crop of...
Who knew? Hegelians in Vermont. I've been in Jerry's Hegelians in Vermont.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So his idea of wisdom is, it has to be socially useful. It
Right.
always has to be reformable. It's always subject to the latest social science findings, right? And kind of social science is such a two-edged sword because it can be so helpful, but it was used so maliciously early on.
Right.
So I'll give you one example. How did they get Latin out of the curriculum? Well, in the 20s, they had some first-gen social science research that shows that the skills were not the skills that were learned in Latin were not transferable. You're conjugating, and declining and memorizing will do nothing for anyone unless you're going to be a Latin teacher or a classic scholar. And of course, this was all. And so this was this particular study that showed there was no skills transferability to learning Latin. It was hugely influential in getting Latin out of the curriculum. Now, by the 50s, it's been completely debunked. Right. But of course, it's
too late.
Yeah, it's too late.
Yeah.
Right. So to your question of what do we do to get it back, the first step is a philosophical recovery of realism. And this doesn't mean we all have to be philosophy nerds, and maybe people have taken classes and they say it's too hard for me, but there's Chesterton saying you have to, and even John Paul II says this in Fides et Ratio. We're all philosophers. Mortimer Adler says this, right? You don't have the option of not being a philosopher because we make so many philosophical commitments, and there's so many philosophical decisions in the complex modern world.
Yeah. No, this is fascinating, and the idea that in a bit it's a bit just sort of looking around and seeing everyone is standing on something. There are always these commitments that are prior, and an awareness. I mean, I think minimally you just have to understand what are the foundations for your actions. What are the presupposed by if you're a teacher going into a classroom, who are your students? And I don't just mean by first names, but like, what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to be a young person at this age? There are all these assumptions about what motivates them, about what kind of person they are, about the purpose of their lives. Like, what does it mean to be a child growing into an adult, into old age? What is the purpose of that? What is the meaning of that? And if you throw out natures, if you throw out human nature, if you throw out human purpose, if everything must pass the bar of what today is accepted as useful, then the world is upside down, and you really are just sort of floating. And it seems so unfortunate that Catholic schools were sort of pulled into this. We're pulled into this. Accreditation probably has something to do with it, my guess. And the desire to sort of be accepted into those areas and those arenas. But also to provide excellence, and you want to provide the best education you have. And if the experts in the room are telling you must do X, and you yourself are not an expert, then you'll usually yield to that. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're wrong. So part of this, the beginning, is to recover a kind of basic realism, a kind of basic philosophy, a philosophical understanding, which I think goes by different names in different contexts. So. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to become educated? What does it mean to flourish and have a good human life? What are the horizons for human living that, in terms of the natural, the eternal? Those seem important, and those can be fleshed out. But then you have institutions. I mean, you can have all these great ideas and work out all this philosophy, but until they're embodied in institutions, it's not going to make a difference. Can you say a bit about this? There's like, when did the institutions begin to change? People had this idea that things needed to change. There were problems. But how did this start becoming realized in the form of schools and teacher training, this sort of pushback against this progressive ed? Yeah,
that's a really interesting history. And this was everyone knew from the beginning that this was kind of a fight for the institutions. And that's all it was. And so what they realized was they needed to create parallel institutions, right? So we see like the creation of teachers' colleges in the 1920s. At Harvard and Columbia, Chicago, and in other and very soon everywhere. And the idea was to train a professional class, right, of kind of engineers who could tinker with this, right? So you had to, and so the result of this was credentialism, right? And credentialism is really kind of the product of being in this post-truth Deweyan world where the credential becomes, kind of the authenticator. It's the bureaucratic stamp on, it's the bureaucratic imprimatur. Right. So it was a long wait to get the old Latinists out of the education systems, the old historians, right? The old guard, and they did. And so it was even in the early 20s, there begins the school centralization movement, which I referenced earlier, where it was this idea that things have to be, and this reaches its high point in the late 70s with the creation of the Department of Education. Right, where it's kind of the ultimate centralization, and so, I mean, you can look at this. I mean, this might be, kind of a little diversion that might be worth taking to really flesh this out, right? Okay, so when I did my master's in education, in Boston in the late '90s, there was something that was all the rage called whole language for learning, right? And so it's kind of a modern Deweyan application to this quote unquote, this teaching reading, right? And so you have this, and it was a cult in the 90s. I lived it in Boston. It was an absolute cult at the University of Massachusetts, and you would create all these centers, and the students had to be moving all the time, and each center had to be, somehow reflect their own lived experience, and they would learn. Reading naturally, right, through kind of organically. This was what it was. So you can see all the Deweyan principles here at work, that everything has to be experiential, right? So we just spout these shibboleths like, child-centered, and not knowing that the child-centered movement is the result of this kind of radical denial of truth. We should be truth-centered, and so. The liberal arts crowd, even in the early, I'm going to get to the whole language thing, but this is a point, another diversion. The liberal arts crowd very early on, even in the 20s, were saying, okay, to the progressive ed, kind of, we get it, we get your point. Like, we should never be drill and kill. We understand that there needs to be this experiential aspect, but we don't think you should blow everything up, you know? And so I went through, I saw this really this Deweyan application to reading where they completely discarded the whole, all of these kind of traditional methods of teaching reading. And they sold a gazillion textbooks, and they minted 1 million, expensive degrees, and they got everybody trained, and they had coaches, they hired coaches, and now I knew it was bunk from the get-go. I just knew and so I went into the classroom right after that, and I just immediately dismissed it. I was like, there's no way this works in practice.
Give me phonics.
Yeah, give me phonics. There's no way. And so I would have the public school teaching coaches come in, and they would say, oh, drill and kill, it's everything you're doing is wrong. It all contradicts the latest data, and the kids all have to be in pods, and you can't do rows, and no memorization at all. And I just said, whatever. Right. And then I forgot about it because my life moved on. And then a couple of years ago, there's this podcast that really got a lot of traction by a woman, an educational journalist, I believe she is, named Emily Hansford. And basically she says, and she's very much, kind of in the mainstream. And she says, millions of whole language has been an abject failure. I mean, it's just been a colossal failure. And, there are millions of poor kids now who can't read because of whole language. And everyone knows there's been hundreds of studies done by the cognitive psych crowd that show it doesn't work. And yet the only people who won't admit it are the people in the ed schools. Right. And so that really hit close to home for me because I was working in South Central LA, and then I would work, teaching all day with no breaks, and then I would just go for another 2.5 hours in a literacy center I created, like with this real understanding that if kids aren't reading by the 3rd grade, they're never going to read, and they're going to be locked out of the job market. So this was really hit home, and I rejected it, and we had them memorize, and what was interesting was the test scores went up. And so this is a great example of now, all right, there's another discarded, kind of educational project. I have a friend of mine who was a teacher in New York City in the 90s when all that went down. And she said it was crazy. I mean, the teachers were so opposed to these new methods, but they were forced on everyone. It was from the top down. Nobody wanted to do this in the New York City public schools. And then they tried it for 20 years, spent tens of millions of dollars, and it was a huge failure. And now what do? Everyone forgot the old ways, So you've got to come up with another expensive program to try to, fill the gap.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So they set up sort of these teachers' colleges, and they were able to incubate and develop the Deweyan ideology mixed with these other values that they were importing from other areas, and then basically wait for the old guard to pass on, and then populate the institutions, reproducing teachers' colleges and departments of education and things of that sort at universities, schools of education at universities, and then send their own people out. And that's sort of where we are. And yet there were people who the flame never completely went out. There were people who, you mentioned the folks who were advocates of the liberal arts, liberal education. The flame didn't go out, and some of these things were kept alive, and they seem to be growing now. Can you say a bit about that? Because that seems, in some ways, that follows a common pattern, which is, okay, we've rediscovered what education should be. We've kind of worked it out to a degree theoretically, but now we've got to set up institutions where this recovered vision of education can live, and we can educate young people. Yeah. Can you say a bit about the rebirth, if you will, of what we would think of as more of a more common sense, reality-based education? Right.
Well, the rebirth is really it's a story that I'm even just learning to kind of get a hold of. The rebirth really is about 30 years old institutionally, and it's an impressive grassroots effort that of lots of heroic figures just toiling in the vineyards in complete anonymity, just simply because they wanted to educate their children in the best way possible, and in a way that accords with kind of the demands of human nature, And there is much work going on right now to build parallel institutions, but also to revive older institutions, to work together to recover this great tradition. Right. And so on the one hand, you have all of the, you have the whole program of the progressive ed, which is kind of the kind of obsession with testing, the obsession with standards, the obsession with kind of memorizing factoids and spitting it out on a test so that the funding streams can be continued. Right. A political indoctrination. On and on. All of the obsessions with even kind of bureaucratic maintenance. And then on the other hand, this rebuilding project is saying, all right, let's go back to from Socrates in the Agora on to Hugh of St. Victor, and let's recover this whole birth and development of Western education. And we think of Socrates, it's this insatiable desire for truth in a dialectic way. Right. There's no rhetorical gimmicks. There's no coercion. This is just simply about truth and understanding truth and how that develops in Plato's Republic. We think of the search for justice. What is the the just republic? Aristotle, and as it's developed, the Christian acquisition of Greek wisdom. We think of Augustine and Basil. The development of the liberal arts, and then up through Hugh of St. Victor and St. Thomas, surely has a place at the table. And so there is this, kind of tremendous, enthusiasm for this recovery. I mean, I go to these conferences, and it's what you see again and again is even people who've been through the public schools, and they feel like they've been cheated. Right. This is what you again and again and again. I hear this. I've been cheated. Why did I never read these books? Why did I never have these discussions? Why did I never learn to think for its own sake, for the sake of truth? Right. And so they're trying to do it now in their 40s or 50s or something like that. And so it's a little bit like the introduction to Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, where there's a lot of people kind of cobbling around looking for lost knowledge, and they're putting these kind of, the shards of a once, kind of vibrant, statue back together. Yeah. And this recovery of some basic philosophical presuppositions that were held almost universally. Yeah. And it's interesting that you went back to Plato, right? So the foundations precede Christianity. They actually go back to this sort of
They go back to the ancients, the pre-Christian period, and yet it's brought up along this tradition. But you get these philosophical presuppositions in place. Then you can talk about the basic, the kind of, we use the word formation. Like you're forming the student, against Dewey, where you're in the Rousseauian sort of origins of Dewey, where we're just letting the student explore. I mean, I experienced that in the 70s.
Yeah.
I mean, I was in some sort of enrichment program, and that would have been a prime time for me to, as a young person, to have learned a lot of really wonderful things. But I was given a room with a bunch of centers that I could go around and and it was so superficial. And I did that for years.
Yeah.
And this was enrichment. I could have been learning a language. I could have been learning mathematics. There's so many things that we could have done. But because it was whatever we mean by child-centered, it was Rousseau. That's exactly what it was. I was just kind of wandering in the fields, except it wasn't a field. It was was a very different place.
Right.
But you get these presuppositions in place. You're willing to accept the idea that education is formation. We're actually forming the child toward what we hope will be happiness, toward flourishing. There are certain skills they need to know, certain things they need to be able to do, and there's certain knowledge they need to possess.
Right.
And some of it, and it comes in an order. There are certain things you need to know first before you can know things later. And it seems almost it's common sense. And this was the norm for so long. This began, it seems to me, at the K through 12 level, though, this recovery.
Yeah.
And it seemed to have happened mainly in Catholic and Christian environments.
That's right.
But it's found its way, into now institutions.
Yeah.
Here at Christendom and our sister schools. So it's now possible to go from preschool through the university level with what would have been available to Thomas Aquinas.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I mean, there's a lot there that we could discuss, but it is absolutely at the K to 12 level. So as someone, I've taught hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of college undergrads, and the 3 homeschool kids that you have in class, or the kids that have the classical education versus those that don't. I mean, let's bring this back down to brass tacks. It's like a thoroughbred and an old mule. Right. I mean, it's the kids who have had this formation, their ability to think, their engagement, the spark in their eyes, their curiosity, their attraction to knowledge, like a moth to flame,
right.
And and then maybe 25% of the other kids will be interested but trying to get it, but they don't have the apparatus, they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have knowledge, and then most of the kids are lost. Yeah. They're uninterested, and so. But I mean, to your point of how do we do this, right? We have to do what they did to us. Well, we've got to get they got our degrees and then flip them essentially, right? I mean, how are we going to? They were 100 years ago. How are we going to do this? Well, they got to get our degrees, our divinity degrees, our classics degrees. There was no education degrees 100 years ago. Well, the first doctorate of education was 1921, so it was 104 years. 4 years.
Yeah.
But 110 years ago, there was no such thing as an education degree. And how are they going to do it? Well, they've got to get these traditional degrees, and then they've got to flip it, and they've got to start ed schools, and then they've got to get their own credentials. And so, very much we need to. Credentialism is not important, and it's not irrelevant. And if we need to get a ticket punched to go and get in there, and so what our project is let's do these degrees. Let's do them really well. And let's, bring the spirit of Socratic dialogue and engagement into this space, so that we can read the tradition and the best of the tradition with Dewey and Foucault and Kilpatrick and his project method, and on and on. And I mean, this was where I've seen the most transformations in my own teaching is kind of you take these kind of normie Catholics who've had a very standard parochial education, and they don't know any of this stuff, and they've never had the real robust liberal arts, and they don't know anything about Dewey, right? And you take them and you read Augustine on education, and you read Thomas, and you read Hugh of St. Victor and Bonaventure, and then you read Dewey, and you have to explain, because Dewey's really dense and Dewey's tricky and Dewey's trying to be very coy. Yeah. But when they see how radical he is, and then you read that right next to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, who calls it all out, and that's the book that really says the emperor has no clothes. Yeah. And you read Dawson's The Crisis of Western Education. students are so they're so deeply incensed. What have I been? How did this happen? How have I been robbed? And they see that now the history of progressive ed, when we teach it in detail, it's like one of those marketing blow-ups on the side of the road.
Yeah.
It's just like there's no anchor. There's no form to keep it, to pass anything stable. So it's just driven along by political and financial and bureaucratic whims and whatever the the latest social science research says.
Yeah. So basically, the goal is to introduce future teachers, administrators, principals, headmasters, superintendents, introduce them to the great tradition of the West by having them read, in some ways, reading the progressives alongside the older tradition. And then it becomes obvious.
It becomes obvious.
Yeah. You don't have to sort of impose anything. It just becomes clear that the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah.
And that the future of really what's best for our young people is going to be to recover, not to go backwards per se, but to sort of recover that tradition and bring it into our own day. And so but it seems key that it can't just be from the bottom up. I mean, well-formed young people can be hired into schools, and they can be salt and light within those spheres. But we also need people who are leading schools, who are leading school districts, who have that formation as well, and they have to have the credentials to be able to be hired into those roles.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, really, at the center, there's really three pillars. There's a robust recovery of the tradition. And the Catholic Church and the classical tradition, we have such a robust philosophy of education. We have all the resources we need, but within this recovery, this is not kind of an isolated, strictly irenic recovery where we just are operating as if time doesn't exist. This recovery really demands a robust engagement.
Right.
So I think that in order for the tradition to make the most sense for our times, we need to read it next to Dewey and we need to read the Emile. We need to read Freire. And this is where I've seen where light bulbs go off. People get this, they understand the stakes, they understand why progressive education failed on its own terms, on its own principles it necessarily failed, and why more than ever we need our tradition. Right. And so there's a robust recovery, a robust engagement, and also the practicals of leadership training. And so this might be something worth talking about, because this is an important part. Leadership it's an unfortunate, kind of pseudo discipline that we're stuck with. Right. And so I know there's some people that want to. The global leadership industry is like something like $300 billion. It's incredible. Right. Degrees and high price consultants and YouTube videos and webinars and TED Talks and it's an incredible machine. And so I know there's a number of people who just like to blow it up and say it's all just like fake and everything. I think we're stuck with it. So let's bring the tradition to bear on it, and let's recover it. And so what's really interesting is in the last 20 years of leadership research, there's been a number of theorists in peer-reviewed journals who have gone back, under the banner of positive psychology, to go back and recover and have realized that, well, Aristotle was right all along. Right? Is that virtue leadership actually is the most virtue theory is actually that provides the best foundation for effective leadership. Right. And so they package it in modern ways, and there's all kinds of studies that show this. So I mean, it's positive psychology at its worst moments. It's like pretty miserable. It's like the whole kind of this whole kind of the self-care movement. Right. It's like and I don't know. I don't have anything against like warm towels and little stones on my back. If I ever experience that, it'll probably feel good. But really, but at its best points, it shows, it's this kind of cross-disciplinary approach that shows, lo and behold, that human beings flourish in a certain way. Right. So suddenly you've got these, very secular-minded psychologists talking about eudaimonia and flourishing and these things. And now, do they mean it the same way we do? Do they know? Well, probably not. But they're also the ones that have to, give us these studies that show that, there's literally hundreds of studies that show that people that go to church are happier than people that don't, and people that are honest and, are prudent, et cetera.
Right.
So, all right, let's bring in the latest research and show as that the tradition actually is more alive than ever, right? And that we can bring in Ciceroan leadership. We can bring in St. Thomas. On the 8 integral parts of prudence are it's the manual right there for leadership, and it just needs to be recovered and packaged. And once you understand how the classical vision of leadership, it's like stuff like Lencioni actually, which is really helpful. Like some of the Lencioni or Jim Collins, and you understand that they are in their own way, probably without even knowing it, re-articulating. Like Lencioni on team building. Like he's great stuff on team building, right? I mean, what he's really doing is trying to say, all right, like how can we provide modern corporate structures for circumspection and and the use of memory and all these things that Thomas says are included in the perfect act of prudence, right? And this is so there's all kinds of ways that we can use prepackaged. We can use the best of modern leadership theory, which is there's lots of garbage out there, but the best like Lencioni and Collins to as a window to recover the tradition. So some people say, well, why can't we just go back and read Cicero? Okay, well, you take Cicero into a boardroom and see how much you're going to be able to get buy-in, do a staff meeting or something. You need this condensed stuff that can help guide and regulate conversations. So we want to train leaders as well in this engagement and this recovery.
So it's really an integration of the tradition, achieved by engaging that tradition, but in dialogue with the sort of founders of progressive ed, so you can actually see the difference. But then also integrating in the practical skills of leadership, but also the other practical skills you need. Because it's not enough, as you say, to sort of bring Cicero into the boardroom, as much fun as that might be on occasion. We actually need people who can lead schools, people who can lead school districts, who know how to use spreadsheets. They have to be able to have the professional, those kinds of skills, but also they have to know what it means to be human. They have to know what human flourishing really is like and what it comes from, and why we're social by nature. And they have to, in a way, it's a degree and there are degrees that basically pull it all together. And then that allows us to build the institutions, to retake the institutions, and then to lead them. And that's what's best for the students.
Absolutely. And this is, I mean, and I don't think we can underscore this enough. When I started kind of developing these education degrees, I had a very interesting conversation with some very seasoned classical ed administrators. They were pretty kind of high-level administrators. And I said, what degrees can I build that will help you the most? And they said precisely this. They said, we don't have anybody, we have no trouble finding people who have read Cicero. We have trouble finding people who can hire and fire, and they can work budget spreadsheets, and they can deal with building committees, right? And they have the soft skills to handle all of the complexities, and they can do the strategy. And so this is the question then in terms of leadership training is, all right, how can we bring the tradition to bear in the development of these skills that are very particular to modern institutions, but yet not totally unrelated to, what the tradition gives us as well.
Well, I must say when I talk to you about these things, I experience a lot of hope, because it does seem that things are moving in this direction. And that 20 years from now, those who've given their lives to recovering the tradition and bringing it to life in our own age they are in fact, things are going this way, and there's a great cause for hope. So thank you for all your work, and thank you for this conversation, and I look forward to seeing where things go. So
thanks, George. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you for listening to Christendom Conversations. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. To learn more about Christendom College and its mission, visit us at christendom.edu. Until next time, may we all continue to seek the truth, live the faith, and restore all things in Christ. God bless.